Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michaela Denny, and I serve as Director of Training and Technical. I serve as Education and Training Director with the Voices for Florida Open Doors Outreach Network. I'm very pleased to be here today to be able to provide to be your host for our latest monthly Perspectives webinar. This one is focused on the intersection of sex trafficking and motherhood. So our Perspectives series is aimed at highlighting state and national trends in the work that survivors, service providers, activists, and thought leaders are engaged in here in Florida and nationally. So for each edition of Perspectives, we choose a theme, and this month's theme is motherhood. Because we have the quickly approaching month of May, we know that that's a time when we honor mothers for all that they do for us. But what are the mothers and children that have experienced trafficking? How might their experiences influence their relationships, their parenting style, and family health? In order to discuss this, we asked Dr. Yarrow Garcia of the Florida Gulf Coast University, Marianne Thomas, Director of Anti-Trafficking at One More Child, and Dr. Abraham Salinas, MD, MPH, and PhD of the University of South Florida. Dr. Garcia, or she prefers to be called Yarrow, currently serves as a clinical and accreditation coordinator at the Department of Counseling at Florida Gulf Coast University. She's a counselor, an advocate, and an educator specializing in complex trauma and disclosure and trauma survivors. Dr. Yarrow has been recognized for her work with survivors of human trafficking, domestic violence, and sexual violence and other violent offenses. Dr. Salinas serves as the director of the Harrell Center for the Study of Family Violence at the College of Public Health, Associate Director for the Center of Excellence in Maternal and Child Health Education, Science, and Practice, and Assistant Professor at the University of South Florida. His research and publications address maternal and child health and family violence, including adverse childhood experiences, intimate partner violence, youth violence, and various other aspects of intimate partner violence. Dr. Marianne Thomas is the Director of Anti-Trafficking with One More Child. She's both a behavioral psychologist and a survivor of exploitation. Dr. Thomas is an expert in the complex needs of sex trafficking survivors with a rich history of working with addictions, homelessness, children, and young adults who have been exploited. Dr. Thomas currently serves as the Director of Anti-Trafficking for One More Child. In her current role, she provides mobile services to human trafficking victims, trains team members while inspiring an exceptional standard of care for survivors, and is leading the charge in establishing a comprehensive clinical approach that inspires change in the early intervention stage of working with survivors. Dr. Thomas considers herself a lifelong learner with a master's degree in mental health counseling from Florida Gulf Coast University and a PhD in behavioral psychology from Walden University. So welcome you all. We have a very qualified panel that we are getting excited to get engaged with today. And so the first speaker panelist that I'd like to start with is Dr. Salinas. Dr. Salinas, can you tell us a bit about your work at the Harrell Center and some ways that trafficking impacts maternal and child health?
Thank you for having me. Yes, the Harrell Center is an academic center, but at the same time, we are very much community engaged. It exists over 25 years. Actually, next year it's going to be 25. My correction. Connecting academia with organizations that address forms of intimate partner violence, child maltreatment, elder abuse, and other types of violence that exist in the community. What we do is agencies such as yourself have either training, research, and evaluation needs. We try to meet that with the faculty and students' capacities that we have at the College of Public Health and throughout USF Health. Having said that, some of the examples that the way we work is, for instance, domestic violence shelters right now have a need to understand racial equity and how victimization is different for these different racial ethnic groups. So we do focus groups with survivors to try to understand their experiences. One example with human trafficking is related to community organizations that are in healthcare. So we did a survey to understand healthcare providers' attitudes towards sex trafficking and human trafficking, because it has been found that healthcare providers play a very important role recognizing victims of sex trafficking, yet they have negative attitudes toward the victims. So it's important to recognize that they have these negative attitudes so we can do training. So that's an example of the type of projects. We do not work directly providing treatment for victims, but we do provide technical assistance. Yeah.
Great. So kind of going along some of the research that you've done and what you're understanding about medical providers, et cetera, what connections do you see between the trauma that's experienced oftentimes by mothers and how that might influence their relationship with their children?
Yeah. In I can explain a little bit of what happened in the neurobiology of the person. Is it possible for me to share slides or?
Yeah, it is. If you scroll to the bottom, if you have the share screen,
Yep.
you can share there.
Sounds good. So thank you. And I did have some statistics, but I'm going to go directly to your questions on trauma. So trauma, it's ubiquitous. It's everywhere. It can happen for many different traumatic experiences, but sex trafficking and human trafficking and sex trafficking, it's not just a trauma. It's a lot of trauma, but it's also composed with the history that these survivors bring as well. Like, for example, they have been previously victimized in their households, and they have a history of abuse as well. And when they become mothers, these experiences impair their ability to attach with their babies, impairs their ability to also develop positive uh, attitudes toward parenting, and at the same time impairs their mental health and their mental health of their children. So if we don't address this history of victimization, then we will see negative outcomes throughout the life course through the generations. So this is just a graph showing the adverse childhood experiences. That I wanted to just also mention something about the trauma response to answer to your question. When survivors of all kind of traumas experience the traumatic response, they will continue experiencing that even after the trauma, the violence has finished. So survivors of sex trafficking, even after they have been rescued by the police and other first responders, when they go in their future relationships or interact with healthcare providers or any type of providers, really, their brain will still respond like if they are in danger. So, and that is the perception of threat can be triggered by someone touching them, by someone asking them to do something against their will, or they feel that they are being pressed to do something. So that danger response in the body triggers a survival brain response, and therefore and impairs their ability to make decisions, impairs their rational thinking, and impairs their ability to connect with others. And all that impact motherhood. In particular, what we're having here is this part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, which is the logical thinking, the smart part of the brain. It's hijacked by an emotional brain response or survival brain response from the limbic system and the memories in a way that they cannot cope. They cannot make decision making. So imagine a mother that has to deal with a baby crying and feeding the baby, and in the middle of the night, and doesn't have this prefrontal cortex activated because of the trauma response. The crying of the baby may trigger memories about the abuse that she went through. So that mother, it cannot make, in fact, it will have impaired decision making to assess the baby. And therefore, we have cases of shaken baby syndrome in which they're trying to shake the baby to help the baby, or maybe neglect because they cannot cope with that situation, so they may not attend to the child needs. Um, Or they may not do any abusive or neglectful behavior, but they feel very insecure and low self-esteem as mothers, and motherhood would not have that rewarding experience that it should be. So I hope that answered that question. I'm going to stop sharing.
Dr. Garcia, kind of listening to what it is that Dr. Salinas had to say, you know, what really resonated with you in terms of the people and the work that you've done?
I think two very important pieces. One is the state of mind, the psychological state of mind of a survivor by the time that they exit the trafficking situation and they are now coming in contact with providers, whether it is healthcare, mental health care providers, advocates, mentors, other survivors, and understanding the psychological state of mind that they are in. And I think what I want to add to that is so key and important for us to understand that by the time that they're talking to us, whether it is they're telling us part of their story or they're sharing something or they're having a physical exam, whatever it may be that they're doing with someone who is safe in the community, the process of doing that, just talking about a piece of their story could be a reason for a trigger. And now they're experiencing symptoms of anxiety and fear and shame and guilt just by having that conversation. And now that triggers all those parts of the brain that Dr. Salinas is talking about into the person feeling like, I don't want to come in contact with that person again. I don't like the way I felt talking to that person. I don't want to have to go through that again. So there comes the avoidance many times of not wanting to reach out again or not wanting to meet with someone who could help and provide the right services and the right resources. So I think it's so important to keep in mind, and even sometimes having to explain that to survivors. That resonates with me quite well. And I think the other piece is the physical part of what they have been through, especially with when it comes to the point where they're being faced with motherhood and having to still deal with the memories that are sitting there, but also the daily reminders that something is wrong with me because I was trafficked. And so, for example, sometimes that has to do with experiencing problems during a pregnancy because of the aftermath of the trafficking situation, whether it is severe infections or pain or sometimes miscarriages. We know from research, there was a research study done a few years ago that indicated that 87.7% of survivors had ended up at a healthcare facility while being trafficked. And from that research, we understood that many of them had experienced pregnancy, STDs, abortions, miscarriages, urinary tract infections while being trafficked. And after that, during the process of trying to become a mother and having the process of getting pregnant, many of them, about 55% of them, reported that they had miscarriages due to symptoms from being trafficked. 46% of them indicated that they experienced excessive urinary tract infections as they were trying to conceive and to be pregnant and so on. So then there's also those physical reminders, along with now maybe going into the process of having a child and living with that child, and sometimes now experiencing also triggers related to, I had a baby girl, and because she's a girl, what do I need to worry about because of my experiences while being trafficked? What about my memories of being trafficked affect my relationship with my baby girl? What am I scared of because of what happened to me? And so that really resonates with me.
And from your perspective, Dr. Garcia, what do you feel are some of the most important and effective treatment modalities for survivors of sex trafficking, particularly thinking about mothers?
Okay. I think it very much depends on where they are in their process. So depending on the symptoms that they're experiencing, and I'll explain what I mean by that. So sometimes the symptoms that a survivor may be experiencing at this moment has to do with their thinking. They can't get themselves out of their mind. They can't get themselves out of their head. And by that, I mean, that is a lot of cortex based type of symptom in the brain. So the treatments the modalities that work best for that are going to be cognitive processing therapy or cognitive behavioral therapy. Now, what if the survivor is so emotionally charged? And so a lot of the symptoms that they have come from emotional dysregulation or emotional impulsivity. So a lot of the decisions that they're making are emotionally driven. And so they're in that emotional chaos. The treatments, the modalities that work for that are treatment techniques like dialectal behavioral therapy or EMDR therapy. But what if the symptoms are coming from the memory system that Dr. Salinas was talking about? What if what's happening to them is that they keep remembering what happened and they're experiencing nightmares and they're having triggers? So now we know, oh, okay, your symptoms are being mainly affected by your memory system. Okay, the techniques that work best for that are going to be techniques like prolonged exposure therapy, traumatic incident reduction, brain spotting. EMDR also helps with this. So it really depends on what they're experiencing and where they're at.
Okay, great. So Dr. Thomas, I kind of want to bring you in here. I know you have vast experience with this population. First, I'd ask, what from what Dr. Garcia and Dr. Salinas said really resonates with you, and share some thoughts about that.
Sure. Thanks, Michaela. I really appreciated how Dr. Salinas explained how our brains are reacting to the trauma and our inability to attach to our children. That's very common that we see across survivors, no matter when they had their children, whether it be while they're still in trafficking situations or even after, as Dr. Garcia was talking about, that inability to separate some of those emotions, thoughts, and feelings from our reality. And so that is a problem that we don't attach to our children. But then the other problem is that as survivors, we don't even know to ask for help. We are almost incapable of asking for help. We have learned helplessness. We've been taught for so long that we only have our trafficker to look to. And so we don't go to service providers. When we go to the doctor, we're not telling the doctor the right things to get the help that we need. And so a lot of what we see is parents who really want to parent their children and don't have the skills, because often what we do as service providers is we work with that client who has been trafficked and we say, oh yes, you need help parenting, but we forget that they really miss a lot of those life skills while they were in the trafficking situation. So they don't have the skills to do the parenting that they need. And it's not just the detachment from the child, it's a lack of skills. It's a lack of understanding of what a child needs, possibly because of their own life. They maybe didn't have that growing up as well. And so they have no framework for what a parent even looks like.
So tell me a little bit more about your experience in working with survivors, Dr. Thomas, and in particular, how you have noticed in some of the cases that you work with, and of course, not exposing any particular information, that it's really come up that the issue of mothering and how they're bonding and or interacting with their children has been impacted very clearly. The example I think a lot of times is when they talk about generational trafficking, et cetera. So I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about that.
Sure. Like Dr. Garcia said, that is a fear that we have too, especially if we have daughters, that whatever led us to be vulnerable, that we are fearful that our children will also be vulnerable. What I'm seeing with the clients that we work with, as you know, our clients are under the age of 24. And so we're seeing a lot of young mothers in their teens still. And teens in general don't have the skills that they need to parent. And then when we add in all these other things like the trauma that they have from trafficking, a lot of them are going to be in the state system where they are wards of the state. And so they have a lot of voices speaking into them about what to do with their children, but it's a lot of very official people and not a whole lot of actual teaching. They're not getting a lot of the teaching from community partners how to be a parent. They need parenting classes, but those don't address the trauma also. So right now what I'm seeing is a lot of separation where we talk about trafficking and we talk about parenting, but we're not talking about parenting within trafficking.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Dr. Salinas, I wanted to ask you if you wanted to add something to that, especially from the public health perspective.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, I'd like to add something on the responses to trauma and how that impact parenting, uh, and the therapeutic aspects of it, and how they can help to improve parenting. When survivors of sex trafficking um, are re-exposed to triggers of trauma, they will resort and very likely will have responses related to something called dissociation. So they are that dissociation is the mind disconnect from the body in the sense that we're not able to perceive how much stress and how much tension we are experiencing. And that is a very important thing in parenting. If you're feeling overstressed and if you're then parenting, it's impaired parenting and stress. So that dissociation can reoccur later on through the parenting process. And survivors need to develop something called interoceptive awareness. So learn to recognize their body signals, learn to recognize that they're starting to get into stress, learn to recognize that they need to take a minute or more for themselves. And that little space helped them to start learning about new parenting skills. Without that, you can send them to all parenting programs that you want to send them, but they won't learn. I mean, not because cognitively they're impaired, just because emotionally they won't be able to face the triggers in the same way as others that don't have trauma.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I'm hearing from you all, and this is actually something I think that we've heard over a lot of our perspectives webinar, is how that trafficking impacts not just the individual, but also to their support system, their loved ones, et cetera. And obviously today we're really focusing on that aspect of mothering. Dr. Thomas, so based on your work in the anti-trafficking field, what would you imagine that you've encountered, many women have experienced that are also mothers? Can you speak to like the multi-generational aspect of that that's come up before? And I think that's a really important part to add.
Sure. A lot of us, that is part of our story, right? Is that it is generational, that it happened to our mothers or our other family members, and it's a part of our life, a part of our family story. And the fear is, of course, that if we're still in the situation, because what I'm hearing from your other esteemed guests is a lot of talk about after the person's away from the trafficker, right? How we parent after we're away from the trafficker. But what we know is a lot of our people are parenting while they're still in trafficking situations, while they still have one foot in the life still. So even though they might want to get out, even though they might be trying to get out, they're still very much trauma bonded and connected to that trafficker, who also may be the father of the child, right? And so we have that muddiness to add to it. And even if a parent has all the best of intentions, all of the help and support around them, the child is still very susceptible to trafficking, to drug addiction, to other things that go along with that lifestyle, because the parent is still, as I said, one foot in that world, one foot in that life. And even if the parent is trying to keep the child safe, because of the environment around the parent, the child is sometimes very unsafe and can fall into other vulnerabilities as well. And that's, again, because the parent isn't quite there where they're able to do the processing like Dr. Salinas and Dr. Garcia are talking about. They're not to that point yet, and they're not quite out of the life yet. And that is what we see a lot of, is that especially these young girls are having babies while they're still at least a little bit in that world, and they haven't quite made that exit yet. And so there's even more fear for their children because of the fact that there is all of this ugliness around them, and they're in that world where the crimes are being committed, the drugs are being done, and so the child really is at a disadvantage because the parent isn't quite ready yet.
Okay. And Dr. Garcia, in your experience with the clients that you serve and the research that you've done, what kind of resonates with you about what Dr. Thomas had to say?
Yeah, and I think to bring what Dr. Thomas and what Dr. Salinas is explaining in terms of the long-term effects that we see with this, I have worked with survivors who spend, after completing therapy for 2 or 3 years just for the trauma that came from being trafficked, now they're spending another 2 or 3 years, sometimes even longer, working on being a mother, working on how can I get better and better and better at doing this so that the same thing doesn't happen to my child. Now, what Dr. Thomas is saying is something that we're seeing almost as equal in the struggle, that the younger that a mother is, and the younger that the person is, especially if they still have a foot on that trafficking scenario, now you have perhaps a very different perception and approach on how they're seeing being a mother, or their ability to even be a parent to that child. And so that becomes a very different type of struggle, and a very different also type of support, because that person is starting from scratch. I don't even know what my identity is as a mother. I don't even know how I can connect to that identity. And so the struggle there is different.
Right. Well, I appreciate that. There was, I wanted to mention that Dr. Salinas said that one resource he put in the chat was somatic experiencing using interoception and proprioception as core elements of trauma therapy, and he included a link there. And I think that's just reviewing what you were just talking about.
It means to connect with your identity and with your body.
Yeah.
Because you've been disconnected. And it's an essential element of trauma therapy, at least in systematic reviews, is becoming more and more important. One of the reasons why, spending time with animals is therapeutic, because you become more aware of that other creature and you yourself as well. Part of the reason why yoga works, as well as addition to trauma therapy, and as well as other things that are related to body base. But that's not replacement for cognitive behavioral therapy or other forms, EMDR, others. I'm just saying that it's an additional thing that we need to consider.
And I do want to chime in one more time on this, because I think it's so important, and it's kind of it's very basic, but we just started to become so aware of how strong this connection between the mind and the body is with trauma. And just to give one example of what Dr. Salinas is explaining is, what do I notice my body's telling me when my baby's screaming in the middle of the night?
Mm-hmm.
Am I tensing up? And it's noticing that your body actually did something different when you heard the baby crying. It's a process of seeing that almost constantly throughout the day, to start to understand how your body is automatically responding and sending a signal that's maladaptive to your mind, and how the conjunction of those two things creates more symptoms and more behaviors and more thoughts and more problems that are affecting motherhood, that are affecting your ability to connect to the baby, to the child.
I have
Also important to mention is that when you pay attention to that distress that's emerging, you also decrease the emotional response and bring back
Yes,
that prefrontal cortex, so you're able to find help. But unless you
that's right.
become aware, that won't happen.
Yeah.
So we had someone chime in from the audience, and I think it's an important thing, and I'm thinking maybe Dr. Thomas, especially kind of knowing your work and the things that you've been doing recently. This person said, the same thing happens to our child. What do we survivors do when our trafficker pops up and harasses us in front of our kids?
Oh, that is tough. And I can empathize with that. And I hate it, but there's not really a way to keep that away. Of course, police intervention always, and you protect yourself as much as possible, but that doesn't change the fact that the trafficker was there and traumatized your child in some way. My question to the person is the trafficker also the father? Because that does make a difference. There is a difference between having an abusive person show up and disrupt your family, and we have discourses for that. You call the police, you get a restraining order, you protect yourself, right? And then you seek help and you work that out in therapy with your counselor. But when the trafficker is also the child's father, and Michaela, you know my story well, that is this part of my history, is that my children did come from trafficking situations. And so now you have to learn how to parent with a person who has been abusive to you, to your children, but the state still says that they have rights. And so that's a whole different question. So I would wonder if that's something we wanted to go down. That's another rabbit hole though.
Michaela,
Yes, please.
sorry. And I would like to add to this question too, of course, not knowing the difference here, the importance of attending to the child when that happens, and even using that as an opportunity to connect with the child, right? So now that the child has been exposed to that, I work with survivors to help them learn how to attend to the child in that scenario by saying, I'm so sorry that this happened to you. Mommy's here. Let me give you a hug. And that's an opportunity to protect and connect when that happens.
Dr. Marian Thomas, since you kind of mentioned it, and it seems like you might be willing to share a little bit. Do you want to kind of talk a little bit about your experience? And I know I've seen you give another presentation on something very similar. If you'd be willing, I think that people would be interested in hearing.
Sure. So personally, I do have 4 children, and all 4 came from trafficking situations. And so I did have to learn how to parent my children alongside an abuser, someone who the children still love, someone who the children still want to be with, and someone I had to learn how to stand next to at everything, birthday parties, graduations, whatever, he was there. And so that is a different thing. I didn't have that space where I could take a lot of healing for myself, because it felt like, as the doctors have shared, the trauma was always in my face. I was getting re-traumatized on a very regular basis. And so that does make a difference. I saw that the writer of the question spoke in and said that we're not talking about a father to the child. It's somebody outside of that. And I can still empathize with that, because traffickers don't go away very easy. We have that trauma bond, and they have this hold over us. I like to say that I left trafficking at the age of 30. However, my perpetrator still had mind control over me for the next decade, where I still did as I was told. I still showed up when I was told. I still very much was under his control. Even though he didn't control my body anymore, he definitely still controlled my mind. And that's part of it. That is part of this guy popping up in this young woman's world. He lives a few blocks away. He shows up when he wants to. That's part of the control that the trafficker has. And the only way we as survivors can get out of that is to physically go away. We have to move, because society, police, whomever, has not put it in place to protect us from that person. So we have to take all of those measures to move ourselves into a safe place because the world is not doing it for us.
Right. And so kind of pulling out again, kind of the macro scale, I'd be interested in hearing from Dr. Salinas again. And, when we talk about this issue of trafficking and, certainly mothers and intergenerationality, how do we frame this as a public health concern? How might we address this as, individuals like myself who are, doing education, or I'm more of a kind of a nonprofit administrator type person. And then we have Dr. Thomas, who's working directly, and the same thing with Dr. Garcia. But from the public health perspective, what do you see are like the most fruitful paths?
Thank you for that question, and thank you to Dr. Thomas and Dr. Garcia for sharing their experiences. On the public health side, trafficking, sex trafficking specifically, it's a major global health problem. And we know that there are millions of lives around the world claimed, and it's a multi-billion trillion industry as well. So it requires collaboration of multiple sectors in society. And one of those is obviously, the first responders, victims assistance services, but that is insufficient. We also need to include school systems, healthcare. We also need to include policymakers, and we also need to gain political champions so that attention to this matter, it's increased as well. So more resources exist to prevent it. Now, adverse childhood experiences is the failure of this generation. And I'm talking about all the last three generations, baby boomers and millennials, and the next one is the failure of society, because trauma is affecting everyone right now. We see a statistic just for adverse childhood experiences, up to 36% of the population had at least one adverse childhood experiences. And if you go in sex trafficking, you see that 80-90% already had that before they were victimized as sex trafficking victims. Sex trafficking, it's something that it's quite widespread, and people just think that this is something like a very rare from the movies, have a media conception, right? But a lot of things are happening nearby that we are not aware. People are abused or sex trafficked based on debts, unlawful debts, and people are paying their debts, forced by perpetrators on that, and they don't see themselves as sex traffic victims. So we need to also work with the community. Organizations such as churches and family community centers can bring more attention to the community, because it is a major global issue, yet it is invisible. Yeah.
There's a question that came in, and it's quite a sophisticated question, but I thought that I would kind of touch on it a little bit. One of the things is this person is saying that, they're a law enforcement officer, and they're really trying to understand when the person that they're responding to, for whatever reason, if, they're having a traumatic response, or is it something different from that? So, what kinds of things would you look for? Are like specific trauma indicators that we need to better identify, or questions that we should ask for individuals who might be responding in the first person?
Want any of us to respond?
Anybody who's interested, yes, please.
Okay, I can start. I'm sure we can all chime in on this. Most definitely someone who has either convoluted information, almost as though it appears as they're lying. That's something for law enforcement to understand, that they may not be lying. A lot of survivors of trafficking, when they first come in contact with law enforcement, or even after repeated attempts, was in the back of their mind as they're talking to law enforcement is, what kind of trouble am I going to be in when my trafficker finds out that I'm talking to law enforcement? And so they do manipulate some of the information they're providing. They're providing information that may seem confusing and convoluted. That's your first sign. For law enforcement, someone who appears as though they're lying and you are looking for certain signals, right? Where are they? What location are they in? What is the story? What are the details? And the information appears to be convoluted. Pay attention to that. That's usually the first sign. And I think that a lot of misinformation has gone into this topic because law enforcement at times is expecting the trafficking survivor that you're seeing on Google pictures. They're tied up to something, they're behind a closed door, they're in some secluded area. Most trafficking survivors are going to be found in regular hotel, motels, and houses in communities where we live. So.
Dr. Thomas, what would you add?
I like how Dr. Garcia put that. I also want to add something else that you might see is not only will our stories look a little convoluted, but our behaviors too, right? We are afraid of what's going to happen. We are afraid of the trouble that we're going to get into when police get involved, not only because of what the trafficker might do, but because of crimes we've committed ourselves, that we're afraid of what's going to happen. We're afraid you're going to take our kids away from us for whatever we're doing. And so all of that fear comes out sometimes as anger. And so we can look aggressive, we can look erratic. And so that is all things to notice. I don't know that I can tell law enforcement how to tell the difference between an aggressive person who's been traumatized and just an aggressive person. I think that would take a whole lot more training. But I do encourage you to kind of look beyond what you're seeing to what might be behind it. That there might be a reason that the person's being aggressive, and see if you can see what that is. Sometimes you can see behind it. You can see this person's being very aggressive. However, I can tell that they're really hurt. And so I think that is part of it. And also just knowing we have been trained to not only fear cops, disrespect cops, but downright hate them. Okay. And so we were told you're the enemy. We are told you're coming after us. You're coming after our kids. You're coming after our life. You're coming after everything that we know. And if that's my whole life is that trafficking and that's all I've ever had, when the police show up, I'm not real cooperative because I have been programmed to believe that this policeman or policewoman is there to harm me, not to help me. And so we're not forthcoming with details. We don't often recognize that we are even victims of sex trafficking. I myself was way out of the situation and already finished with a master's degree and working on my doctorate by the time it went ding, ding, ding. Oh, that's what that was. And so we don't readily identify. Even some people never self-identify as that's what was part of their story, even though the rest of us as experts can look around and see this fits the criteria, this fits the legal definition for trafficking. But it is especially hard, like Yaro said, we're not getting clubbed over the head and taken to foreign countries. That's less than 5% of trafficking. What is happening is someone is coming alongside us as our friend, as our boyfriend, as our girlfriend, as a family member, and convincing us that all these actions that we are doing are a part of either our family obligation, our obligation to our loved one, our trafficker, that it's part of what we are supposed to do in order to take care of our family. It is part of what we are supposed to do in order to take care of our children. And so we are very distrusting of police when they come to help us because we've been so programmed to believe that they're only going to hurt us.
Dr. Salinas, it looks like you've added a few things into the chat. Do you want to kind of
this is from experience with assessing healthcare providers, which is another form of first responders, right? Sometimes survivors are taken to emergency rooms or they go to other forms of healthcare. They don't feel that they have the capacity to reduce trafficking at all because it's something that it's a crime and it's not up to them. That's a kind of an alternative view. But yes, they can do a lot. So, but by learning about it is one thing that they can do. So become sensitive to the needs of survivors and how this happens and the role of your agency or whatever profession you're in preventing trafficking. Next is try to develop empathetic reactions. So instead of having these negative uses like, you know, stereotypes, or you are biased for any reason toward the victims, you need to develop that compassion and then empathy. And then that is lacking in many first responders, sadly, because they do approach victims as criminals sometimes, and victims are placed in jails, and when they're, so they are not treated as victims, but sometimes they're treated as criminals. And that's one thing. The last one is to foster more positive attitudes toward helping them. So, and that is only something that can help connect with services. Just the first step to start healing. Yeah.
So what I'd like to do is just kind of going back to the overall topic. Certainly when we're talking about the relationship or the intersection of sex trafficking and motherhood in particular. So what are one or two things that each of you think are the most important for our audience to understand about the relationship between those, and kind of what we need to be aware of? And I'll start with Dr. Garcia, if that's okay.
One or two things
Sorry,
that providers.
what do you think the most important for our audience to understand about this relationship between sex trafficking and the implications on motherhood?
Yes, okay, got it. Oh, it's tough to answer that with one or two things because this is such a complex topic. I would say that the first thing is to understand that it's not a cookie cutter process. Each survivor is going to have their own unique process in how they go about motherhood and to support how they go about during that process. The other piece is that every parent makes mistake even when they have not been trafficked. Mm-hmm. We all do. Survivors of trafficking sometimes make mistakes that our society is very judgmental about and does not understand. And I think it's so key for us to understand, would this person be doing this if this wouldn't have happened to them? Most of the time, the answer is no. And so understanding that their mistakes are coming from their trauma, is coming from what happened, is coming from this very unique experience that happened to them, that was done to them. So I think those are my two key points. I want to say so many other ones.
Well, I if there's, what do you want to sneak another one in there? We're more than happy to hear what you have to say.
Okay, I think my third one is also understanding that once a survivor becomes a mother, you are looking at an entire structure. It's no longer just a survivor and the symptoms and the trafficking and the history and the memories and the trauma. You now have a structure. So that child is also in need of support. Perhaps they're needing family counseling. Perhaps it's going to be a long-term process. As that child changes, baby's 2, now baby's 5, baby's now 10, now that baby's a teenager, that survivor may need support throughout that process because different things come up.
Great. Dr. Thomas, same question.
I echo what Yarrow said, especially the generational piece of it, that we are a unit now. Like she said, you cannot just treat me. You cannot just pull me from a trafficking situation and teach me how to behave. You also have to look at my children. You also have to give them treatment and counseling for the abuse that they endured. Even if it wasn't trafficking, we know that there was still psychological abuse in that situation. And so they need a lot of help. And I do feel that currently we separate those pieces too much, and that needs to be a part of it. And looking around, it's familial, right? It's usually, if it's happening in one place, it's happening in multiple places. So understanding that even while you're treating me and my children, if I'm still going back to the same family, whatever that looks like, that all of this, the ACEs that Dr. Salinas shared, all of this is still going on in that family. it's very hard to have a healthy brain and go back to the same environment. And so teaching me that I might have to make some real changes in my world to remove myself from the environment that was unhealthy, that led me to being vulnerable, that led me to being able to be trafficked. And so the better that you do at treating the whole unit, as Dr. Yarrow said, then the more successful we're going to be.
And Dr. Salinas, what would you add?
Yeah, I would add something related to the system level. We really need to press all forms of social service providers to have policies to serve survivors of human trafficking, and visible policies, and train their staff. Child welfare professionals need to have that training, because when they go to the home and find a case of child neglect, they remove the child without knowing that mother uses substances as part of the sex trafficking context that she's surviving. So we also need to train physicians and nurses, and need to train teachers. And most importantly, the general society needs to change their stigmas that they have about survival of human trafficking. And that's something that needs to be at the national level. Thank you.
Thank you. One of the comments that's come up, I think it's Zaria, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. They say, never even thought about this intersectionality, but this training has given me so much more insight. And I think that's really, really true. I think that's an important part. When we talked about perspectives and the different kinds of topics we wanted to introduce, we definitely wanted to think about those intersectionalities. So I think, from the public health perspective, from the motherhood perspective, the trauma that individuals experience, I think it's important that we recognize how those are connected, and how they're related to one another, and how one may impact the other. So I really appreciate that. It looks like,
Can I say something on that?
Sorry, yes, please.
About the intersectionality. It's not the same to be a survivor of sex trafficking if you're a Black woman, if you're a white woman, if you're a Latina woman, or a man. There are intersecting identities there. And there are prejudices that providers will bring when they serve those different types of individuals. Because for example, race intersect with gender in a way that it increases the burden of stigmatization.
Mm-hmm.
And when you also add that the person comes from a low socioeconomic background, and also without resources, and it's you also put an element of LGBTQ and also immigrant status, then it becomes a whole different level of intersecting adversities.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, you also have family dynamics that affect that intersection. And so even when the survivor, who's now a mother, is trying to do the right thing, is in counseling, is learning, is going through this whole process to get healthier and become better at being a mother, she has the family influence of saying, well, that the child is not doing what you said. Go ahead and give him a beating in the butt. Go ahead and use physical force. So you have that family dynamic intersection as well, affecting the process.
Well, and it kind of goes to what Jocelyn has just chatted in. She said, what can service providers, treatment centers do to combat the cultural component that normalizes sex trafficking due to lack of basic needs, or the historical connotation that says it's okay? And I think that's a really big part of it as well. And to what you were saying, Dr. Salinas. Marianne, did you have something to add?
No, I agree with all of that. And what we are seeing in the field is that it is drastically different. And often they want to lump us all into one as survivors. And yes, we all have that commonality where we had some shared experiences. However, it looks much different for me as a white female than it would for somebody else. And like we were saying, the stigma, it's just different. A male the stigma for a male is so much worse, in my opinion, than for a female. And then in certain cultures, we see this a lot with our young kids, the 16 and 17-year-olds that we serve, that in certain cultures, it is a badge of honor to be trafficked. It's you're standing up for your community, for your man, you're taking care of your people. And it's part of what you do. And it's, you want these products, it is perfectly acceptable and even revered to go have sex in order to get whatever it is that you want, whatever material items it is that you want. And young girls are being taught by family, by mothers, by other people in their community, that it's perfectly okay to use your body in order to get things. And that's going to hurt us all across society if that's the message that we're giving to children.
Certainly. So we're talking about many, many different levels of communication, outreach, education, et cetera. That's great. Thank you. Thank you all so much for giving the time here. I'd like to reserve, I've been looking to see if any other additional questions, and there have been a number of questions that have come in. Unfortunately, we won't be able to get to them all, but are there any last points that you would like to share with this audience, given their level of engagement, about next steps, or where they can find more information, or find ways to work with individuals like yourselves? Could we start with Dr. Garcia?
Sure. I think maybe perhaps bringing it all together from what all of us are trying to say, the next step is perhaps start to pay attention to the signals that your body is sending your mind, and vice versa. Start to pay attention to who your body's responding, because that's a pretty good place to start. That's your body, it's your mind. See what's happening with it. If you're noticing that there is something off that happens with your body during certain thoughts or certain interactions with your child, then pay attention to that and then take the next step. So what's the next step? Talk to your advocate or your mentor, see what kind of counseling or therapy or treatments you can do to improve that, or what kind of techniques you can learn on your own, and be proactive. And that'll start, and that'll get the ball rolling on what else you can do as a mother with this history to ensure the health of you and your child, and to ensure that your parenting style is what you want, not what your trauma did to you.
Dr. Thomas, do you have anything to add?
Yes. Awareness in general, just awareness for what HT is, for what it looks like, so that we're not all looking to a movie like Taken and thinking that that's what sex trafficking is. Making yourself familiar with what it looks like domestically, and even what it looks like in your own community, because we do serve 10 counties across Florida, but it looks much different in South Florida than it does in North Florida. It looks much different in a place like Orlando than it does in a place like Ocala. Okay, so knowing that what it looks like and familiarizing yourself with what to do in your area, who do you call? So if you do see something, that you're calling the DCF abuse hotline if you see a child in danger, or you're calling the human trafficking national hotline if you see something going on around you, because that is how you actually get us to the help that we need, is by community members being aware of what it is and being willing to speak up and say something on our behalf.
I guess we'll round out with Dr. Salinas. What are your final thoughts on this?
Someone mentioned the connection between domestic violence and human trafficking. Strong connection. In fact, domestic violence often overlaps with trafficking as part of the coercive control, the spectrum that perpetrators would use to control their victims. So it's important that we also connect the dots. Whenever you find this is like cockroaches. I'm sorry to bring that image to this conversation. You find one, there will be others. So when you find a form of violence, child abuse, elder abuse, there might be other forms of violence, and so that's something to pay attention to as well. In the chat, I'm going to share resources from domestic violence shelters. so that you put your zip code and can find domestic violence shelters nationwide. So with different resources for you available. And they should also help you with human trafficking as well. Um, so I just put it in the chat.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Thomas, Dr. Garcia, and Dr. Salinas. We're very pleased to have this level of expertise join us for our Perspectives webinar. For those of you who are interested in finding out more information and or possibly getting in touch with one of our panelists, please do, I put it in the chat, please email contact@voicesforflorida.org. And we will be checking those. And we thank you again for your participation. And as we go into May and Mother's Day, I hope that we can keep these really important things in mind as we celebrate and honor our mothers. So have a lovely afternoon, and thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye,
Very
everyone.
nice meeting you,
Bye.
Dr. Thomas, Dr. Garcia, and
Bye.
Michaela.
Nice to meet you as well. Bye.
At your service here. Bye-bye, and everyone.
Bye.